Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this very special event. My name is Rachel O'Neill. I'm an assistant professor here at LSE in the Department of Media and Communications. I'll be chairing tonight's event, which marks the launch of a fantastic new book, the cover of which you've seen in the auditorium. It's very exciting new text, authored by two esteemed feminist colleagues, Professors Shani, Orgad, and Rosalind, Gill. It's wonderful to be gathered here together in this way. I know for many of us, it's the first in-person event that we've attended in a very, very long time. And it's also great that we're able to host this event in hybrid format and to have an audience joining us online also. Just a quick note, for those attending in person, if you could please keep your masks on throughout the session, we would be appreciative of that. Before introducing our speakers, I just wanted to say a few words about the book that we're here to celebrate tonight, which I've had the pleasure of reading in advance. Published by Duke University Press, Confidence Culture interrogates an injunction I'm sure we're all already familiar with: to smile brightly and stride forward, to lean in and take up space, to believe in ourselves so that others might believe in us also. This is a gendered injunction, one that more often than not is addressed to women, in whom confidence is assumed to be lacking, and for whom confidence is preferred as a solution to myriad problems we face in our homes, workplaces, and indeed on a global scale. In their book, Shani and Roz walk us through various facets of confidence culture and ask us to consider what the exhortation to be confident does politically, culturally, psychically. It is, I think, a deeply ambivalent book, one that recognizes the importance of what confidence may index or afford, the capacity to navigate the world, more or less unencumbered by doubt and insecurity, more or less assured of one's own value and competencies, while also questioning how and why this injunction circulates with such intensity in the current conjuncture. It is a book that takes its object of study seriously, without ever ceding its critical vantage point. This, for me, is an enduring feature of the work of both Shani and Roz, and one that is instructive for all of us who are committed to the project of feminist media and cultural studies. Only recently released, the book is already beginning to shape wider public dialogue and discourse on questions of gender and equality. I know Shani and Roz have spent the last few weeks giving interviews for major publications in the UK and internationally. I'm quite interested myself in what this popular resonance might tell us, whether the book's reception might attest to or hasten a kind of confidence fatigue, as it becomes increasingly evident, in no small part through work such as this, to many of us, that the attainment of confidence is in no way straightforward, nor is it a panacea for the enduring inequalities that shape women's day-to-day lives. To open the event, we'll first have a presentation from Shani and Roz, after which our two panelists will each offer responses of about 10 minutes apiece. We'll then provide for some time for all of our speakers to respond to one another and be in conversation, after which we'll open the floor to questions from the audience, both online and in person. After the event closes, those attending in person are very welcome to join us outside for a reception, which will take place just outside the auditorium. Before I hand over to Shani and Roz, I'd like to briefly introduce each of our speakers. Shani Orgad is Professor of Media and Communications here at LSE. An interdisciplinary scholar with a keen ethnographic sensibility, Shani has published widely across the fields of media and communications, sociology, and cultural studies. She's the author of numerous books, including the truly stellar 2019 work, Heading Home, Motherhood, Work, and the Failed Promise of Equality. Rosalind Gill is Professor of Cultural and Social Analysis in the Department of Sociology at City, University of London. Roz is a truly prolific academic. My own personal EndNote library has more references from her than any other scholar. And she's the author of such touchstones texts as Gender in the Media, as well as many field-defining works on culture and subjectivity in the context of post-feminism and neoliberalism. Pumla, Dineo Gqola, is joining us via Zoom. She is Professor of Literary and Cultural Studies at the Center for Women and Gender Studies and Chair in African Feminist Imagination at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. Pumla has written extensively on the subject of gender and sexual violence and has a new work on this topic currently forthcoming under the title Female Fear Factory, Gender and Patriarchy Under Racial Capitalism. Katherine Angel is Senior Lecturer in the Department of English at Birkbeck, University of London. Writing both for academic and much wider audiences, her books include the brilliantly titled Tomorrow, Sex Will Be Good Again, published with Verso last year. Please join me now in welcoming our panel as we invite Shani and Roz to give their presentation.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for the introduction. Thank you also, Pumla, whom we'll see shortly, and Katherine for discussing the book with us and helping us celebrate it being out there in the world. We'd like to say big thanks for the Department of Media and Communications here at LSE, and especially to Luam. Where are you, Luam? Yay. And Hannah from Cities University Gender and Sexuality Research Center for helping organize the event. And thank you all for being here, both in person. It's really, really wonderful to have this in-person event, and all of you are joining us online. We really appreciate it. We have so many other people to thank that it could take the whole evening. So we can't mention everyone, but first and foremost, we would like to thank our families, some of whom are here tonight. Of course, friends and colleagues and our wonderful students and the amazing feminist community that we are so fortunate to be part of, who've shared with us so many confidence culture examples while we were writing the book. And we're also, not least important, a tremendous source of support and inspiration. We'd also like to thank Duke University Press, who've been just nothing short of amazing in terms of their work on the book, and a special thanks to Asma Iswani. Are you here, Asma? Is she here? Not. Okay, Asma is the artist who did the cover of our book, which we absolutely love. So we'll talk for about 25 minutes, or we'll take it in turn, and then we'll move to our discussants, and there'll be plenty of time for discussions and questions.
I'd like to echo Shani's thanks. It really is immensely touching and overwhelming. We're quite emotional and quite excited to be here tonight. We haven't really been out for 2 years, and it's very special. Thank you so much for coming, and thanks to everyone. We want to say a little bit about how we came to write this book. We'd been working across different fields, work in parenting, intimate relationships, body image, global development, and we began to notice the rise of imperatives to confidence and related dispositions, such as resilience and positive thinking, and how they were taking on a new cultural prominence across many apparently unrelated spheres of life. So the welfare system, sex and relationship advice, even international development. And once we'd noticed this, it was that classic thing that we started seeing it everywhere. It was in social media, it was in the music industry, it was in workplace culture, it was in love your body messages in advertising. And we thought, I wonder if this is just going to be a short-term trend. Is it just that confidence is having a moment? But several years later, our culture's obsession with confidence, particularly women's self-confidence, shows no sign of diminishing. And in fact, it's really been intensified by the pandemic and now the cost of living crisis. So we situate it as part of a ramping up and visibility of popular feminism that Sarah Benet-Weiser has discussed so compellingly in her book, Empowered. And this is very particular kind of neoliberal feminism, as Catherine Rottenberg has also written about so brilliantly in her book, the same title.
So whenever there's a talk of inequality, we noted there's not far behind noise of confidence. And what we noted was really striking similarity of the messages and the injunctions across quite diverse domains. And you can see the domains here on the slide. And the injunctions were very similar, were about lean in, strike a pose, believe in yourself, boost your confidence, etc., etc. So the 5 domains that we located and we kind of identified confidence culture, which we decided to focus on, and that the book really mirrors in terms of its chapters, are the body, confidence at work in the context of workplace, in relationships, in mothering, and in international development initiatives in the global south. Now, the paradox across these domains is that precisely as inequalities deepen, precisely as pressures on women get more intense, women are called on more and more to believe in themselves, yeah, and to be confident. So, for instance, as women suffer profound inequality at work, including significant pay gaps, sexism, there's so many workplace schemes that are genuinely designed to promote gender equality, but they respond by offering women confidence training, confidence coaching. Confidence coaches also outside workplace promote workshops, training programs. During the pandemic, both Rose and I attended a few virtually confident workshops to learn how to be confident, not just in the crowd, but on Zoom. And similarly, at the same time that societal policies following the recession, following the years of austerity, now following COVID, we know have hit women hard and disproportionately. At that very same time, topping bestseller lists are books that place female self-confidence at their argumentative heart, or as parenting and mothering is increasingly squeezed with the kind of withdrawal of the welfare provision. Books like How to Become Sorry Not Sorry Mom become bestsellers. And so while while women and girls are subjected to intense appearance pressures and they're subjected to unrealistic body ideals, at that very same time, the beauty industry, the fashion industry calls women to just believe in themselves, to wear confidence. That's the best thing you can wear. And the latest example, many of you may have seen it now on the tube and elsewhere, is L'Oreal's new campaign, new lipstick campaign, which tells us all women that we're worth it if only we put the shades of conviction lipstick. So all these examples really triggered us to think, how does confidence culture work? And we want to say very briefly, just to show you the ways in which we identified it works. So first and foremost, confidence culture is clearly a discourse, yeah? It works through and mobilizes a range of different yet patterned discourses. And time and again, when we were researching for the book, we've been struck not just by the sheer proliferation of different areas of life that we've just discussed, in which the same ideas are kind of conveyed, but literally the same words, the same phrases. So things like, are you your own worst enemy? Yeah, or just believe in yourself. And we found those phrases in a range of examples, from advertisements to makeup and policy reports or workplace programs for women to feel confident.
But confidence is not just a discourse, it's not just a set of messages, it also materializes as a visual regime, an affective regime, and a set of practices. So starting with the visual, you can see from these images, which are so recognizable from the kind of cultural visual habitat that we occupy, that a relatively stable set of images has been developed to convey ideas about female autonomy, female power, capacity, women facing forward, striding out, standing tall. And the four images from the right are images from the Lenin Getty Images collection. But confidence culture also operates in and through emotions, feelings, desires. Injunctions to self-confidence are not just exhortations to speak differently or behave differently. They're also fundamentally exhortations to feel differently about yourself. And this is regarded as the very hardest shift to make. And so what women are advised to do as they're going along towards that goal is to fake it till you make it. And the idea goes that if you perform confidence enough, that ultimately those confidence markers like assertive posture or assertive speech will eventually generate this internal shift, and you will become the confident person that you are currently faking. not sure if that's going to be personally working out for me. The way it's formulated, oh dear, we lost, and it's okay. The way it's formulated in popular culture is very often through sort of loose ideas about hormones, neurotransmitters, that if you do this, then your body will be flooded with serotonin or dopamine or testosterone. And they're often referred to in a kind of dumbed down language as the happy hormone or the cuddle chemical. I'm actually waiting for them to talk about the confidence hormone. It's bound to be that.
And finally, confidence is also practice. Yeah, it materializes in a huge variety of different practices, ranging from advice on how to generate confidence holding your body, to particularly taking quizzes that are meant to measure your confidence quotient. Rosa and I scored very high on these. How to write your emails, how to communicate, how to breathe. The paradigmatic example, which you can see here, is really the whole advice around how to generate confidence by holding your body in a particular way. And that's what we can term the confidence pose. You can see how it's repeated across examples. And across all domains, and this is Amy Cuddy, for those of you who don't know, this is one of the most popular TED Talks by American social psychologist Amy Cuddy, who tells you that when you prepare for evaluative moments when you're anxious in the elevator, in the lift, you have to do the Wonder Woman pose, the confidence pose, and speak differently, stop apologizing, write emails differently, breathe differently, stand differently. All these are about different practices through which confidence materializes. And while we didn't investigate whether how individuals take up these practices or not, we do use the concept of practice in the book to really underscore the potential force of confidence culture in shaping not just how women feel or how they think, but literally and practically what they do.
So just before I get on to speaking about the ambivalence of our own position and our critique, I just wanted to say that, like, taking those four elements together that we've just discussed, so discourse, visual regime, affective regime, and a set of practices, we're also trying to make a contribution to thinking about neoliberalism more widely. So we're trying to contribute to a growing literature that sees neoliberalism not just as a kind of political and economic rationality, but also sees it as a set of everyday practices, which our colleague Jo Littler has expressed so vividly with her wonderful phrase about how neoliberalism insinuates itself into the nooks and crannies of everyday life. And not just individual practices, but also, as we would argue, psychological practices. So we really see this as part of a kind of psychological shift in neoliberalism. Now, to just come on to this point about ambivalent critique, we really wanted to take this new common sense of confidence to task, but we want to make clear that our aim is not to do a takedown of confidence. We're not against confidence per se. I mean, who would be against wanting people to feel more comfortable, more, happy in their own skin, to be more confident? Not at all. It's not a sort of straightforward critique of confidence. In fact, we really want to stress how ambivalent we feel about confidence culture, and also that we ourselves are not inured to its kind of emotional and affective force. We've found ourselves moved to tears by, yes, we admit it, by Dove adverts, yes, by accounts of apps by accounts of sort of lack of confidence, by Love Your Body campaigns, by apps that also instill a sense of well-being and self-belief, by equality and diversity programs that really seem to genuinely celebrate women's achievements. And we're also, we have to say, ambivalent but enthusiastic participants in the confidence culture. For example, we repeatedly encourage our own students to try and take up more space in the world. and to not apologize for themselves, to write more assertively, to, you know, slash out those phrases like I'm just, or I'm no expert, and I think that, and actually be more assertive. So we start really from our own deep sense of being implicated in this culture. It's not just something out there that we can conveniently set ourselves above or beyond. We're part of this. But it's partly because we are part of it that we are so deeply uncomfortable about the way that it increasingly becomes framed as the solution to inequality and injustice, that how it completely reframes those things in individualistic terms, and how it shifts the blame and responsibility for inequality and social injustice away from institutional and structural injustices to assumed deficits in women. And that's led us to scrutinize it and ask these kinds of questions. And we're just going to look at these questions through two case studies. Oh, it's me. Okay. So we're going to look first at commercial love your body messages, which really do exemplify the confidence culture's status as a discursive, a visual and an affective regime. From Dove to L'Oreal to Nike, they center on confidence, on empowerment, on self-belief, on gratitude, as well as having an instantly recognizable set of visual and discursive codes, the kind of glossy diversity, black and white images, minimal but rousing piano music, and above all, the conviction that self-belief is more important than anything else. So these kinds of adverts focus on the production of positive affects, and they mark a real shift away from earlier emphases on what's wrong and on the idea that there's something wrong with women, that they need to work on themselves and improve themselves. They're about a kind of superficial body positivity. They're about being confident, believing that you're beautiful no matter how you look, remembering that you're incredible, throwing off self-doubt, throwing off insecurity, believing that you can do it, you have the power, you have capacity, and of course, being grateful. Gratitude's a key theme. And there's a lot of critiques of LYB, Love Your Body advertising, which we don't have a lot of time to go into very fully, but which we build on. So one of the critiques is that at the heart of these kinds of adverts, there are fundamentally a lot of cheats. So there are the use of models pretending not to be models. There's the use of Photoshop or digital augmentation. Well, this is actually repudiated, and the adverts say #no filter or something like that. There's the fakeness or the hollowness of the diversity espoused in this adverts, the sense that the adverts either claim to be showing much more diverse populations than they actually are showing, or conversely, that they do show greater diversity, but only for that diversity to be actually emptied out and hollowed out of the impact. And we discuss this in the book as a dynamic that's post-racial, it's post-queer, it's post-feminist. Another common critique of these adverts is that they cynically commodify feminist ideas. And another critique is the way that the companies that are most implicated in the toxic messages that produce body insecurity are the very ones taking this up most fervently. So the diet companies, for example, the cosmetic surgery clinics. Our own critiques, they build on these critiques, but we also seek to show some other things. So first of all, we look at how these Love Your Body adverts really work to trivialize the extent of body pressure on women, treat the pressure as something quite superficial, unimportant. How they tend to downplay the cultural and institutional forces that produce the difficulties with our bodies in the first place, and how they blame women for not being confident enough, treating this as if it's like a self-inflicted wound, some silly piece of self-sabotage. And one advert that is kind of really iconic of this is Gov's Patches advert, which is really quite notorious. I'm sure most of you have seen it. In it, we're shown a number of individual women turning up to some kind of laboratory, and they're asked if they would like to take part in a piece of research to try on a beauty patch, a revolutionary beauty patch, apparently. It looks like a nicotine patch or a hormone patch. The women put it on their upper arms, they go away, they do the video diary, and sure enough, as the days pass while they're doing their video diary, they all start reporting that they're feeling a little bit better about themselves, that I'm actually feeling a little bit more confident, and those parts of my body that I was particularly ashamed of, I don't feel quite as ashamed as I did before. And then they come back to the lab and the psychologist says to them, would you like to know what's in the product? They all say yes, and then she slides it across the table and we have the reveal moment where she turns it over and it just says one word, nothing. So the advert conveys the idea that it's all in women's heads, that there isn't really anything material, anything real, any kind of real sort of cultural obstacle to confidence, that if you know, wearing a patch that has nothing in it can just transform the way you feel, it's up to women themselves to do that, to undertake that work.
We now turn to our second example, and in the book we have, as I mentioned before, 5 domains. We just kind of want to give you a flavor. The second domain that we want to briefly discuss is the workplace and how confidence culture materializes in the workplace. And over the last decade, and importantly, the financial crisis was a really important moment from which we see more and more confidence exhortations. We've seen proliferation of self-help and advice books. You can see some of them here, but also policy, corporate reports, workplace documents that promote ideas about women's obligations to work on themselves to overcome their confidence so-called deficit. Now, again, in kind of line with what was said and kind of very much in the context of our ambivalence, we do want to recognize that these discussions have been instrumental in putting workplace gender inequality on the agenda. Yeah, so we don't want to dismiss that. But we're also very troubled by the premise of these and many other texts that there's some kind of a crisis that is peculiar to women. And that's the product of self-doubt and perfectionism, you know, our self-inflicted wounds. And that's what's supposedly holding us women back in public life. And it was striking when we read numerous of these books and these reports, how this crisis refers almost exclusively to women's failure to achieve senior positions in the corporate world of work. Now, however well-intended these texts, many of them are self-proclaimed feminist manifestos, the problem is that they call to women to turn inward, to tackle our own inner obstacles. These are terms that are literally used in these books. The Confidence Code, which you can see here, a New York Times bestseller by Katie Shipman and Claire and Kay, they talk about our self-inflicted wounds. They talk about how women, we scratch ourselves and that we need imaginary mittens to protect ourselves from scratching ourselves. And we were really bothered and troubled by not only infantilizing, but the ways in which it turns again the blame onto women. We're doing it to ourselves. And the kind of call also to instead just embrace positivity, denounce negative feelings and thoughts. And fundamentally, what this does is that it turns away from critiques of work cultures, of the workplaces, of the broader structures in society which produce women's self-doubt, and those structures that stand in the way that of women's progress across different jobs and works. So really strikingly, at the very same time of rising precarity, rising inequality, now more than ever after COVID also, when women are being disproportionately affected and injured by recession, by financial insecurity, at that very same time, they're time and again encouraged to harness their individual resources to survive in neoliberalism with resilience and with courage. As Sheryl Sandberg puts it in her so-called feminist manifesto, women are called on to internalize the revolution. In other words, to internalize both the responsibility for the problem and the program of action that is required to fix the problem. And we see very similar constructions to the ones we mentioned in self-help and advice books across very different genres. And they're all about the ways in which women are prescribed with strategies and exercises to overcome this supposed internal flaw. In examples like newspaper and women's magazine, which there's frequently tips, 5 tips to how to become more resilient, 3 tips to boost your confidence, and so, and as well as these confidence assessment quizzes that we took many of them. It's in apps, there's kind of a booming industry of confidence-related apps that are like Shine, Clementine, Sanity and Self, and they all offer, and they're targeting particularly women, and they're offering a set of tools and exercises and daily reminders that are aimed to help women to achieve positive self-regard and positive self-belief. And there's TED Talks like the one mentioned before by Amy Cuddy, who's kind of uses the image of Wonder Woman and recommended this pose. I don't know how many of you have tried it, and if that's the kind of magic solution, probably not. And there's kind of a booming industry of confidence coaches like the one here on the bottom right, just one of many that are thriving in really tapping into this supposed internal obstacles that women need help with addressing. And the paradox is that what's happening is that all this kind of work is to acquire confidence is contingent on women's conscious and intense labor. So even if it's about remind yourself that you are beautiful, it's about working on yourself to remind yourself that you're beautiful. So in other words, to gain confidence, women need to work continuously to manufacture it through self-governance, through self-vigilance, through self-improvement. Now, while we were writing and working on the book during that time, and particularly in the context of the difficult event of 2020, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, in the context of COVID and other crises, we've noticed a shift which at first seemed to kind of unsettle our thesis. And that's what we call the vulnerability turn. And that's a turn towards embracing vulnerability and actually foregrounding insecurity and pain. And paradoxically, in workplace discussions, for instance, more and more there's now, rather than just airbrushing insecurity, vulnerability is now the new thing. It's seen as increasingly actually advantageous, even mandatory in some workplaces now to enable confident and successful performance. And again, while it's not only addressed to women, it's very gendered in many, many ways and in the way it's targeting women. So we have business leaders like David Solomon, the CEO and chairman of Goldman Sachs. We have Tim Cook from Apple. These are all white men who are calling on workers to foreground their pain. But we see that often the ones who are taking it up actually in the public space are women. And that's the idea of vulnerability as a vital asset for success at work. And on the right-hand side, some of you may be familiar with the vulnerability guru, Brené Brown, who has now what we call vulnerability empire, really, because she's popularized this idea that being courageously vulnerable at work, that's a quote, is now crucial for companies' health and productivity. And of course, there's numerous celebrity, Emma Watson, one of them, but also Michelle Obama, Melinda Gates, Lena Dunham, Lady Gaga, all confessing now their crisis of confidence and imposter syndrome. And interestingly, LinkedIn is a really interesting platform in this sense, because if only until quite recently, what you would see often mostly on LinkedIn are these polished posts where people would put their best selves because they want to be employable. Now, more and more we see on LinkedIn some very raw kind of posts about vulnerability at work, people highlighting their burnout in the context of mental health problems, experiences related to racism, abuse, depression, and so on. So it's as if the ideal feminine professional self is now required to be both confident and vulnerable at the same time. So as we said, when we started kind of noticing this, particularly around the 2020, we thought that kind of unsettles the whole thesis. The confidence culture is gone, but actually, we think kind of this image really encapsulates it. Rather than contradictory, this new normative ideal of vulnerability seems to be actually deeply implicated in confidence culture and to bolster it. And just very briefly, we want to say that very much like confidence culture, these calls to vulnerability are further work on ourselves. So now we need to work on demonstrating vulnerability, exhibiting vulnerability at work and in other contexts. And there's very little of any call in the discussions about vulnerability calls to develop community, to invest in structures that are supportive and supportive to women in particular. There's very limited of any discussion of the structural forces of vulnerability, racism, poverty, ill health, sexism. There's no discussion of collective and structural solutions that are needed, or very little discussion to address vulnerability. Again, it's very much through the turning inwards. And as Brené Brown says, embracing vulnerability is all about being seen. So it's performative. And crucially, it's not that we can all like lose it now. It's about inhibiting a very strategic vulnerability and controlled. And really importantly, what we notice is that vulnerability is ultimately really a site of privilege. Who can afford to be publicly vulnerable? It's those ones that are often powerful, men or women. And it's often when you're crossed to the other side because you've already overcome your imposter syndrome. And now you can go and have a whole interview and tell the world about how you suffered from imposter syndrome precisely because it's securely placed in the past. And crucially, very much like confidence culture and part of confidence culture, it's profoundly gendered. It's women who seem to be the most enthusiastic recipients and kind of demonstrators of this call to embrace vulnerability.
So to conclude, we are not against confidence per se, but we are critical of the cultural prominence that confidence has achieved, specifically as a supposed solution to inequality and injustice. And we've called confidence a culture because we want to capture something about its dissemination across multiple sites and multiple domains. We also call it a cult, and we call it a cult to capture the way that it's been placed beyond debate. It's become an unquestioned article of faith. And it's particularly targeted at women. So whenever we hear talk of gender inequality, we know the word confidence is never far behind. It blames women for their own insecurities. It exculpates, it lets off the hook institutions, organizations, wider structures. It's as if the obstacles are simply in women's heads. They're not the result of anything wider. It systematically trivializes the injuries experienced. It's as if it's just a matter of deciding to feel better, deciding to be more confident, more positive. And it requires psychic and emotional transformation, as well as a physical one. It requires a kind of upgraded form of confident subjectivity. So it's creating a whole new level of psychologized, punitive regulation of women and more work on the self. So the confidence industry tells us, don't challenge an unjust world, just let's help individuals better cope with injustice by working on themselves. And that's why whenever we hear about gender inequality in mainstream popular politics and popular culture, the word confidence is right there. And we hope that our work begins to challenge this.
So we end the book with a chapter, our conclusion chapter is called Beyond Confidence, where we try to explore possibilities, if not to completely move outside confidence culture, because we're implicated in it, at least to push against it and to push its boundaries. And it's in this context particularly where we very much look forward to have both Pumla and Katherine's responses. Pumla's work, which has been really inspiring, and about particularly how what she calls and describes as culture of fear, would be really interested to know and think about how the culture of fear corresponds with the confidence culture, and particularly also Pumla's call in her book, Female Fear Factory, to render this factory strange, to estrange us from this factory so we can perhaps create new ways of living. And Katherine, your wonderful book and your emphasis on ambivalence and on opacity and on not knowing, against this kind of privileging of self-knowledge about desire, is something that we hope and feel there's lots of dialogue, and we're very, very much looking forward now to hear both of you in dialogue with our book, and to thank you again for joining us and celebrating with us the book.
Thank you so much to Shani and Ros for that fantastic introduction to the book, an overview of some of the key themes and ideas that they set out there. I do want to just draw your attention to the discount code that's available to purchase the book. So via Combined Academic Publishers, the discount code is available here. Be sure that you put it in all as one word. You don't need any spaces or anything else. It's just the one word. I'd also now like to turn to Pumla. If we could have Pumla brought up on the screen, please.
Good evening. It's really good to be here talking about confidence culture. Congratulations to Shani and Rosalind. I am going to speak about aspects of the book. I won't be, I mean, there's so much to say in response to and about the book. But I have 10 minutes, so I'm going to be selective in what I pick up on. Confidence culture is the designation Orgad and Gill gave to a phenomenon they started tracking in 2010 as they noticed it taking on a new cultural prominence across many unrelated spheres of life. Invitations and formulas for greater confidence, not as isolated instances, but as a magnifying and traveling set of tropes for how women are supposed to appropriately occupy space and live their lives. These scripts, as they've already told us in their presentation, are in self-help books, sometimes in the autobiographies of powerful women in politics and corporate settings, in texts that seek to assist women in the workplace, as well as in texts that offer the promise of parenting in ways free of the pervasive guilt that comes with the patriarchal, capitalist mothering script. Collectively, the texts and sites analyzed in confidence culture gesture to a world in which women are free of dis-ease. But as the book shows, such narratives, discursive and visual, not only re-inscribe older, familiar tropes of women as in need of correction and instruction, they also make women responsible for structural inequity. This is because confidence culture narratives re-inscribe what used to be called in previous centuries the woman problem, which is both a pointer to the problems the world makes for women, and more importantly, women as the problem in wanting, needing, yearning, and agitating for the world to change. Confidence culture holds out the promise of liberation and happiness through confidence, but makes women the problem through a sophisticated process that Orgad and Gill unfold, a sophisticated process of individualizing a structural problem in order to leave what Derrida calls violent hierarchies unchanged. Here, once individual women find the proper route to confidence and self-love, they have embarked on the path to success. There's a paradox at the heart of the rise of confidence culture that the book points to. Women are bombarded by images of their inadequacy across various arenas, from the beauty and diet industries to mediated forms, while being pressured to believe in themselves. Here, believing in themselves, having confidence, is presented as though it immures women against structural oppression and injustice. It does more, much more than this, and holds several dangers. Dangers evident when we pay attention to its locations and masking forms. Orgad and Gill write that, and I'm quoting them here, that these exhortations have become ubiquitous across so many domains of social and cultural life, and with such striking homogeneity, that they have come to constitute a kind of unquestioned common sense. End of quote. One reading of their book then is of a project of rendering confidence culture, its architecture, and its specific deployments of Foucault's technologies of self, uncommon sense. To do so requires unbundling confidence culture into the confidence imperative, the confidence cult, and examining the sites of their amplification. Now, confidence imperative and confidence cult are formulations within the book. While the confidence cult targets different genders, the authors tell us, there are notable ways in which women are its intended audience, subjects, and targets. Whereas men's confidence culture offers invitations to take up leadership, top performance, greater control of the self and world, and increased status, women's confidence cultural invitations are corrective of emotion, of body, and of self. Here, women are cast as lacking, deficient, excessive, or diminutive. For men, women, and other genders, confidence culture holds out a promise of arrival at happiness and success. For women specifically, it mediates relationships to power in ways that echo older patriarchal regimes and systems we have seen elsewhere. As a contemporary 21st century phenomenon, confidence culture, confidence culture draws from circulating critical discourses and radical movements from times past and current in superficial ways. For example, it appears to take the calls for wider representation and widening representations and structural transformation seriously, insofar as we see selectively a wide array of bodies and bodies as identities in many advertisements analyzed in the book. Superficially then, as the subjects of confidence culture are differently abled, raced, embodied, it gestures to a creation of a world that is already changed. As I read example after example detailed here to track the scale of the phenomenon in the book, I was reminded of Gayatri Spivak's illumination of the ways in which hegemonic power has long mutated in these ways. In the 1990s, Spivak argued that the center incorporates aspects of the language and symbols of radical movements in order to better survive by projecting the mere appearance of change. Spivak was writing of specific 19th and 20th century colonial logics. Orgad and Gill are writing of a 21st century articulation that produces what they call the neoliberalizing of subjectivity and remaking of feminism along neoliberal lines. This is because many of the sites of confidence culture opportunistically reference established feminist critiques on patriarchal policing and disciplining of women's bodies and psyches, as well as numerous global radical critiques, post-colonial and decolonial calls, without any of the accompanying changes in concrete historical material conditions. In other words, they never move beyond the gesture. In the examples chosen by the authors of how confidence culture articulates in framing women's proper place in the workplace, although unexamined and unengaged here, there are echoes of the kinds of feminine disciplining that feminist scholars of respectability politics have also taught us. As the authors argue, the authors of confidence culture argue, the rise of confidence culture at a time where there is also increased global public discussion of a mental health crisis is not accidental. It is not a contradiction, it is not accidental. This is because confidence culture itself emerges out of and in the aftermath of a context in which Freud, psychoanalysis more broadly, and Maslow's work take on mass appeal and circulation, permeating the world, not just of the academy and of psychology as a discipline, but traveling predominantly into the popular cultural through the foregrounding of working on the self. I found additional resonance with some of the arguments on the slipperiness of the framing of the worlds of women's work, from equality to empowerment. In my own work on the mediated discourses of women's empowerment post-apartheid, within the constitution of what I call the New South African Woman between 1994 and 2000, as well as in my 2013 book, A Renegade Calls Impiwe's exploration of the price of women's successful visibility, I was working with a different geographical terrain, Southern Africa, rather than Orgad and Gill's US, UK, Australia, and New Zealand. I argued there that one of the strategies through which shifting pro-feminist legal and policy interventions were met and undermined was first through the replacement of equality and feminism, or even women's rights, with women's empowerment narratives, which highlighted women's power in the workplace while requiring trade-offs in the domestic space. In other words, the appearance of equality was important only in terms of what was publicly demonstrable, confidently, visibly, publicly, as increasing numbers of Black and white women moved into position of power post-apartheid. At the same time, however, such women often were required to provide some narratives that ran counter to the public workplace power they held. Often in interview after interview, they would have to declare that they may run companies, but they went home and took care of their husband. The phrase, "I'm not a CEO at home," proudly articulated by women who held high positions, by women who also employed domestic workers to run their own homes and therefore did not need to take on additional domestic labor at home, seemed to signal something else. It was what they signaled about women's power as conditional that interested me. And so I found particular resonance between this conditional power, this conditional claim to power, this temporary claim to power and access of power, the slipperiness of power that Orgad and Gill outline in the ways in which vulnerability functions in the workplace and the discourse of vulnerability after Brene Brown, with this earlier articulation that I had also studied. So I found, continuities and perhaps synergies, even as we're working across very different times and studying different phenomena. The second equally striking matter for me was on vulnerability, or the reading of vulnerability after Brene Brown and its migrations to elsewhere she may not have anticipated, of vulnerability rather than I'm sorry, let me read that again. On vulnerability after Brene Brown and its migrations to elsewhere she may not have anticipated, Orgad and Gill argue that rather than reading this move as antithesis of confidence culture, it is implicated in confidence culture, that it more than this, it has sparked a different regime of visibility to show imposter syndrome, like the soft feminism of the essay, or the empowerment of women's empowerment of the South African corporate women, only in order to overcome it. Vulnerability is that which such women can or must choose to show. It matters only when rendered visible. But this is a visibility regime only available to powerful women and some men. This is because there's no currency for vulnerability at work for many women across the world who are confronted by stereotypes of women as already always overly and inappropriately emotional, especially in the workplace. Even for powerful women, this revelation resembles obligatory exposure as one of the current conditions of retaining power. What I wrote off as feeding bits of yourself to the machine in order to be taken seriously and indefinitely postponed being rendered as train wreck, which is how excessive vulnerability is often codified for women. Vulnerability in Orgad and Gill, following Brown or critiquing Brown, is importantly and perhaps most dangerously a solitary project that is to be waded through, to use Brown's language, and one that can be overcome once we clarify, again using Brown's language, the story we tell ourselves. The implication that a different story leads to a different reality. Once women tell themselves a different story, the world changes. But of course, we know this is not true. Emotion, vulnerability included, we know also is raced and classed as the scholarly, activist, and public discourses of more than a century has taught us, as the scholarly, activist, and public discourses of angry Black women or angry Latina women and white women's tears also continue to teach us. And this has implications for the intersections of vulnerability and confidence culture rather than frictions between vulnerability and confidence culture. In Orgad and Gill, the compelling argument of vulnerability culture working in line with rather than against confidence culture made these connections quite clear. It also made me question their specific choices about the historicization of the phenomenon, in ways also resonant with Dineo Gaga's work on how women become visible. In other words, the specific ways in which women enter visibility in media and popular text, not as individuals, and what we gain when we examine how contemporary forms of making women visible through discourses of problem, success, or diversity rely on citations from older and longer histories and traditions of inscription. In their bodies chapter, it is clear that although the kinds of visible bodies change, the lessons about how to matter and believe you matter remain the same. Even fact-positive bodies have to make confidence claims. Even in areas of attempted circumvention, I'm thinking, for example, of something like the Fenty foundation adverts rather than the Fenty lingerie adverts. They are interpreted in these ways. And so it seems that the ambivalence is not only Orgad's and Gill's, but that even as hopeful as their final chapter is, that perhaps even those attempts to circumvent confidence culture, when referencing confidence, which they helpfully uncouple from confidence culture. So confidence is part of confidence culture, but confidence culture, as they explain in their presentation and as they so meticulously outline in their book, is something very different. It's a cluster, or it's a regime of means, a structure of meaning. So it seems to me that not only does confidence culture work as a cult, it also becomes an interpretative lens for all expressions of confidence, even when they're not confidence cultish, and all expressions of spatial claims by women. What then are the ways in which different feminist traditions can engage with each other as they theorize similar phenomena from different locations and times? I've offered a few thoughts and provocations on confidence culture, which is an important study that illuminates a specific sociocultural and economic phenomenon, and an important contribution to contemporary feminist scholarship and contemporary British and US feminist cultural studies. Congratulations again to Professors Orgad and Gill.
Thank you very much, Pumla. Now I invite Katherine to say her remarks, please.
I'm really delighted to be here. So thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm delighted not least because I read Ros and Shani's article from 2015, I think, while I was writing my book, Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again. And it crystallized something for me in such a helpful way. So what I thought I would do is just talk a little bit about parts of my book that intersect with the work. So I started writing Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again more or less around the time of Me Too and the kind of resurgence of discussions about harassment and coercion and power relations, particularly between men and women. And I was really noticing in the wake of Me Too that there was a really obviously very important reiteration of the importance of consent. And it struck me that this reformulation or kind of re-emphasis on consent urged self-knowledge about our sexual desires and clear expression about those sexual desires. Know what you want and learn what your partner wants, the New York Times told us. Good sex happens where those two agendas meet. Have the conversation, we were told by Radio 4, the direct, honest conversation about sex before you're in the bedroom. Have it in the bar, the cab home, even if it's awkward. 10 years before that, Rachel Bossel-Kramer had told us that as women, it's our duty to ourselves and our partners to get more vocal about asking for what we want in bed. So women must speak out, we're told, and they must speak out about what they want. So they must then know what it is that they want. As I read these formulations that in one sense were gratifying to me, of course, there can be no end to conversations about consent and what counts as good sex and bad sex. I also felt kind of uncomfortable because I wondered if it really is my duty to look inside myself and fish out my desire that lies in wait inside me and come as if armed with that knowledge to sex, armed with it presumably so that there is no confusion, no mixed signals, no misunderstandings, no awkward moments that will be recast later, re-experienced later as bad sex or assault. So in writing the book, I wanted to articulate a critique of consent that would do justice to my mixed feelings. And I want to be clear, consent is vital, it's crucial, it's just the bare minimum for sex. And legally, I think that affirmative consent is the least bad standard that we have for a law on sexual assault. But I talk in the book about what I call consent culture, which I use to mean the idea that this legal notion of consent is the concept and the site that will help us to resolve the very many sexual ills of our culture. And it's that position that makes me uncomfortable. Why does it make me uncomfortable? Because addressing women in this way, know yourself, be confident, reveals, I think, a fundamental tenet of neoliberal feminism, which is that essentially we have to undertake risk management. So like the rape prevention campaigns that address women as if they must be in perpetual preparation for the inevitable fact of sexual violence, they must responsibly manage the risk that already exists out in the world. Rhetoric around consent can sometimes be closer to that kind of preventative discourse that addresses women primarily than it would like to think. So the mode of addressing women's subjectivity, admonishing them, enjoining certain ways of being on them, deflects, I think, the question of how to prevent sexual violence and places it onto individual women and the ways in which they have to manage that day by day, night by night in their own individual lives. Within some of the rhetoric around consent, the ideal individual who manages this risk responsibly is a vehemently confident sexual subject who knows herself, who speaks confidently of her desires. And the burden of bad sex, if not assault, falls on her. But if she fails, If she fails to fulfill that ideal, who then is to blame for a sexual encounter gone wrong? So what I wanted to point out is that in some of the very well-meaning and important consent rhetoric that we have, discourse that we have about consent, there's a kind of wishful denial of reality. The relentlessly upbeat tones of some of these exhortations about being the confident woman who can say what she wants clearly don't really amount to much, given what we know, given that we know that it can be hard for women not just to say no to sex, because saying no to sex can sometimes lead to male anger and humiliation and violence, but because saying yes can be difficult. Saying yes to what you want or asserting your own desire can be difficult because we live in a punitive culture for women in which we're shamed and punished for precisely the thing that we're exhorted to do, for expressing our desire. So we're often punished for the very positions we're being urged to embody in the rhetoric around bringing your confident self to the bedroom. We know that evidence about women's pasts inevitably comes up, whether implicitly or explicitly in the courtroom. Casual sex, hookups count heavily against women in rape trials. You can't be raped, it seems, by someone you met on Tinder, by someone presumably you met out of a confident desire for sex. Once a woman is thought to say yes to something, she tends to be seen as being able to say no to nothing. Sarah Ahmed said that sometimes the repetition of good sentiment feels oppressive. Might we be looking in the wrong place when we pin our emancipatory hopes on the clear expression of desire? And not just because of these dynamics that I'm talking about a misogynistic culture that punishes us for sexual assertiveness, but also perhaps because there's something in the nature of desire itself to resist being known and articulated in the ways that is urged upon us. While I was trying to articulate these thoughts, I came across the 2015 article by Shani and Ros on confidence culture, and I found it so illuminating. And it really crystallized something for me about this sensibility that they talk of, confidence as a kind of ethos, a culture, a feeling, a structure of feeling that permeates so many realms of discourse and experience. They captured so beautifully the admonitory, exhortatory tone of some of the consent discourse as I was encountering it. It's our duty. Consent can be sexy. They capture the kind of incantatory nature of these feelings that we're encouraged to embody and experience. And they captured so beautifully the way in which women are seen as held back in the realm of sexual violence as well, not just in the realms that we've touched on so far, not by structural forms of inequality and injustice, but by their own failure to be sufficiently confident. Woe betide women then if they fail to be sufficiently confident to assert the risk that they're required to avoid. So when I was thinking about confidence culture from their 2015 article, and also thinking about Angela McRobbie's work on post-feminism, I came to feel that it was actually no accident that the reformulation of consent, the very important reformulation of consent in affirmative terms, and then also as enthusiastic, took root in the 90s, the kind of arch decade of post-feminism. So the post-feminism that McRobbie talks about as a mode in which young women can come forward on the condition that feminism fades away. To be clear, again, affirmative consent was such a huge reframing of how we think about sex between men and women in particular, because it emphasized mutuality, reciprocity, the fact that we should all be interested in whether the person we want to have sex with wants to have sex with us. I mean, it's not a big ask, but it was actually a major shift in our legal and cultural thinking, which in itself is quite depressing. But something of the insistence that I think of as particularly post-feminist, namely that in the name of sexual equality, women must be assertive and declamatory and unashamed, found its way, I think, into the affirmative consent rhetoric. So we slid from a position where, of course, women should be afforded sexual freedom, should be able to declare their desires freely, they should be able to be lustful and perverse and up for it. So an insistence that they are and that they must be so for their own safety. The fetishization of confidence is all around us, as confidence culture delineates kind of so forensically. One of the things that I wrote about in my book was about certain very prominent critics of consent. So I'm thinking of people who've written these, very contested, very interesting, to me, very troublesome books, Katie Boyfie, Laura Kipnis, but also the journalist Barry Weiss, who admonished Grace, the author of an article detailing her unpleasant night with the comedian Aziz Ansari. And in these books, in these critiques of consent, these writers invoke an ideal of the confident woman who can shrug off the injuries, who can fight these pushy men off. It's called bad sex, wrote Weiss. It sucks. Stand up on your own two legs and walk out of the door. So for these critics, the culture of consent and guidelines and laws around affirmative consent cast women as timid, as fearful, as perpetually injurable. And they recoil against this. And in the place of that injurable woman, idealize the figure of the confident woman who can deal with it all. This is not my position. My position is that consent rhetoric positions sexual uncertainty as abject, and consent rhetoric tends to cast the ideal woman as the one who can, in speaking her desire with confidence, manage the risk of a violence that we must accept as always already existing. This sets women up to fail and to be punished for gendered and racialized dynamics of power that are not theirs to shoulder alone and not theirs to resolve alone privately. Responses to rape culture should not be prioritized. I want to thank Shani and Ros for their brilliant work that helped me think through the past few decades and the present, and helped me put my finger on what felt so puzzling and thorny and difficult in my own work. And I've thought of them as sort of companions in my thinking that I was really delighted to kind of be able to have in my text and in my thinking, because it's difficult to articulate the critique of consent. It feels very risky. One doesn't want to play into the hands of people who critique consent in order to dismiss the very real, persistent injuries that people encounter in the realm of sex. And just as Shani and Ros emphasize, the way that encouraging individual confidence can be an important and very moving endeavor, given that women have been made to feel so relentlessly vulnerable and self-doubting and injured, I also try to acknowledge that it is understandable to invoke confidence in our sexual ethics and our politics as a solution to violence. But this is a bind because it redoubles the burden on us to find ways of navigating that violent world. And I think that we should aim higher. And a critique of a neoliberal confidence ethos is one of the very important ways we can do that. And for that reason, I think this work is hugely important to articulate the bind that we find ourselves in. And I urge you to buy the book and to read it. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, for that wonderful response to the book. I'd like to invite Shani and Ros, if you'd like to say anything in response, or shall we go to questions?
Yeah, I don't know.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, can we take questions from the floor, please? Anyone would like to raise their hand? We'll also be taking questions from our online audience.
Hey, thank you very, very much. Yeah, there's so much to say about this book, but I'd like to ask a question about the transformation of and the kind of metastasizing of the confidence cult, as you term it. So I'm really struck by how Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In invocation has really migrated beyond the C-suite that she was talking about. And I was wondering if, in the sense that this idea, this invocation to lean in, it's kind of been democratized. Every woman now needs to lean in. And so I wonder if you could share with us any examples that you found in your work of the confidence cult at work with working class women who are arguably those kind of hardest hit by neoliberalism's kind of structural assaults. Yeah, so I'm just wondering if you could share some of that. Thank you.
You want us to answer or to take?
Yeah, sure, go ahead, please.
Do you want me to take it? So I think it's, first of all, thank you for the question. I think, first of all, there's wonderful work, for instance, by Tracy Jensen and her colleagues. And they've looked at how within the context of the welfare and its kind of withdrawal, there are programs for working class and poor parents, and particularly mothers, around resilience and confidence. So it's, these are programs that are being rolled as supposedly the solution to responsibilize working class and poor, particularly, again, women, often single mothers. And these discourses, we haven't, we draw on others' works like Tracy Jensen's work in this context. And we noticed this, for instance, in employment center, in the context of unemployment, there's kind of, these discourses are recited, variations and iterations of them. So there's a kind of the idealized woman who takes on and demonstrates the confidence is very often middle class, upper middle class white woman. But the way the discourses often kind of travel is to address other women across class and across ethnicity, and disability is another area where we've seen, and Rose can say more about the ways in which these kind of discourses, but also practices and the affective burden is being, without any consideration, without actual recognition of the fundamental structural huge differences. So it's this one size fits all solution.
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. And I just wanted to comment on your term metastasizing, which I think is just a wonderful term in this, and it really resonates with what Pumla was saying as well about how this sort of traveling nature of this discourse. And I just wanted to refer to Lynn Friedley's work. She's written it with a co-author, and I can't remember their name, but it's a fantastic paper, and it's about the British welfare system and about how job seekers now have to demonstrate not only that they're looking for work actively, but that they have a positive mental attitude, and that positivity is a requirement of being able to claim the benefits. I think that's a vivid example.
Absolutely. We take another couple of questions together from the floor. So we have one here, and then there's a question over here, please. We'll take two together, and then we'll get one from online.
Thank you so much. Love the talk, and being a corporate employee, I know how much the onus is on yourself to enhance your confidence and resilience. So my question is that in your work, have you come across examples and studies of how women have also started believing that it's their problem versus it's systematic inequalities, or how other genders also believe that it's a problem of women versus systematic inequalities?
Thank you so much for that. I absolutely love your body of work, all of you. So my question is, while in the West, the discourse is around post-feminist sensibilities that are tied to neoliberalism, that, of course, Professor Gill so wonderfully articulates in all her work. When you move to the global South, especially in the context that I worked in gender and education, the girls, we worked around how confidence is more of a male quality. And when we try to think about how storytelling and reading can, help girls be more confident. What we didn't anticipate is when girls are moved from an all-female setting and they occupy a space that even boys are around, this confidence that girls have newly built is met with resistance by men. And when I think about this, even in the workplace and even in a global setting, how do we navigate around, the structures of patriarchy, the forces of which are so powerful that while women learn to be confident and express themselves confidently, are met with resistance from men who simply, people who simply don't move beyond that and embrace it just like, the women?
So would you like to respond to these two very interesting questions?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. And yeah, I think you've pointed to something really important, which I think is kind of almost like a reception study of this work. It's just sort of like, yes, we've demonstrated the discourses exist. We've demonstrated, hopefully quite persuasively, that there is kind of a confidence culture, but how is that actually being taken up? And do women take it on and believe themselves to be lacking confidence, or are there sort of resistant senses? And I think, that in one sense, we don't fully know, and we would love to do a reception study. We would absolutely love to see how these discourses are being taken up, negotiated, resisted in different contexts by different women. And yet, on the other hand, I would say that we can just see from the sort of things like the proliferation of confidence coaching and the sheer number, Shani mentions that we'd been on a couple of kind of courses ourselves as part of researching the book. The sheer numbers of these courses that are sort of mushrooming, and the sheer numbers of women that are attending them, and kind of locating the issue as a personal deficit or defect that they have to overcome, I think does give an indication that there is at least, some resonance, unfortunately. Yeah.
I think if I kind of heard your question, also you kind of asked about the difference between the ways in which confidence is addressed to men and women. Is that right or not? Or the kind of the gender, I
asked that the genders also believe that it's a women problem.
Right.
So is that a narrative which is getting imbibed by
Right.
believed by the people as well?
Yeah. Okay. Maybe we can move to the also other question. We didn't mention it because we didn't have enough time in our talk, but our we have different domains, and one domain was the Global South, where we actually looked at the ways in which we call this confidence without borders. Yeah, after Médecins Sans Frontières, and then after Beauty Without Borders, which was this kind of a very strange school that was built in Kabul to diffuse and disseminate this kind of ideas and ideals around beauty. And we look precisely at examples that you mentioned, and how initiatives in the Global South are kind of circulating, and these imperatives. And we draw there on works of Sura Roy and other kind of a variety of examples also to discuss this. But I think also what you mentioned kind of ties in neatly with what Katherine spoke about, in the way that the very thing that women and girls are being exhorted to embody and to take on is what they seem to be also penalized for, and where they and that seems to be resisted. So the kind of common example in lots of workplace contexts is that when women are displaying confidence, they're considered to be bitch or bossy, and so on. And similarly, what you said is this kind of double bind in the very thing that we are kind of encouraged to possess, then comes to haunt us. But I think very much also in line, Katherine might want to say more about it, is how do we deprivatize it? How do we kind of get out of this cycle that it is just our personal work and responsibility and duty to take it on, because also the resistance we then experience is personal and it hurts.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I think, you know, that bind, that difficulty is also what makes writing about this kind of material really tricky, because, you know, you're articulating a critique of confidence culture in the full awareness that, you know, there are plenty of women for whom increasing their confidence might help them, at the same time as that injunction is being used as a way to like defang any kind of political critique of the workplace or, you know, gender or whatever. So it's sort of, you know, it puts one in a very precarious position critically. And, you know, that happens certainly with the consent material as well. And I suppose, you know, that's the nature of a bind. What can you do?
I was wondering, maybe Pumla, if you wanted to come in here, particularly because your kind of also South African previous book that kind of also focused on the South African context might have resonance with the last question.
And I think that where I really want to come in is one of the things that I find incredibly, the book is remarkable, but one of the things that I found incredibly useful was the very important way in which you make a distinction between, obviously, not just being seduced and believing in, but actually being supportive of the idea of confidence, but still being able to be critical of confidence culture. And I think it's a very important distinction. And I think you make it very well in the book, right? Because I think that part of why confidence culture is so seductive is that it pretends to be the same thing as confidence. And so while as a feminist, obviously we, as feminists, we cannot, well, I don't know if we can, I doubt we can, we cannot really be in favor of a world that continues to break women down psychically, right? So confidence, there is value in confidence. And there is a reason why we also subscribe to the value of confidence, to the value of you know, even old-fashioned forms of kind of consciousness raising, by implication, had recognized the value of kind of internal affective psychological transformation and work. But of course, the difference between that investment in confidence itself and confidence culture is that the older fashioned investment is in the recognition that confidence can be transformative, that the attainment of confidence is not an and in and as of itself, that women are not the problem, that perhaps confidence then perhaps enables women to better be able to do and mobilize and imagine the kind of collective structural systemic change that we need. Whereas confidence culture is the opposite of that. And I think, I mean, we certainly, I think as feminist scholars, we also are aware that there's a long tradition of this, right? I mean, there's a long tradition of kind of co-opting radical language, of co-opting feminist language, and in order to mask something that is actually kind of dangerously anti-women. And so I think that as I continue to talk about your book, for me, I'm going to continue returning to that distinction, because I think it is absolutely integral, that distinction between confidence and confidence culture, right? So that's really what I want to speak to, and I think you do it, you know, superbly in the book. So that's why I think. And then I don't want to answer that question. I wanted to speak to another question that's in the comments. And someone has asked, sorry, you can't see the comments. I don't know when they're going to be read to you. I see, obviously I have a bias to the people that are online because I'm online.
We have two questions that Lama selected for us that she's going to read out from the online, but hopefully one of them will be your choice.
So there's a question about Lizzo. And I think that I just wanted to say there's a question about Lizzo. Where's the confidence about Lizzo? which I thought was fantastic because your entire final, I mean, not your entire, but Lisa is a big part of the final, of your final chapter. So I'll just read this question from Beverly Thomas. What do you think of people like Lizzo's body confidence? I have a lot of concerns as a fat Black woman myself. This promotion of own your body image rather than claiming a healthy lifestyle is dangerous. And I believe it encourages poor dietary choices and can lead to high blood pressure and diabetes. But I've noticed if you criticize this approach, one is accused of fat shaming. Please let me know your thoughts. And I thought that the way in which you read Lizzo, sometimes ambivalently and sometimes obliquely, in your final chapter was quite productive. So maybe you two want to say a little bit about why Lizzo, as opposed to some of the other people that you obviously don't find as useful to use in that chapter.
Should we take the question about Lizzo?
Do you want to take this, and then we'll take one more?
Okay.
One more from Noam.
Well, to start with, we love Lizzo. My kids are here, so they know I dance Zumba to Lizzo. But on a more serious note, I think, first of all, we felt that to write a book about confidence culture without Lizzo is just impossible. She's been dubbed the self-love, self-confidence queen. But we also, as Pumla very generously pointed out, we kind of thought with Lizzo in our last chapter, which is entitled Beyond Confidence, to show how she's an exemplar of, she embodies in many ways everything we talked about in terms of confidence culture, and also problematically in many ways in that it's very highly commercialized and commodified. But we also point to ways in which she actually pushes against, if not completely outside confidence culture, she does push against. For instance, Lizzo, in all her mediated appearances, in her interviews on her Instagram, time and time emphasizes how she's dependent on a whole body of people who work and support with her. She's one of the only artists who travels to all her tours with her family and with her close friends. And she talks a lot about the need for support and for interdependence. So it's very much against this kind of myth of the resilient, dependent, lack of kind of needing support, confident woman. Obviously, in the most important ways, she says, she has an interview where she says, I am in myself, I am the revolution. I am revolutionary, in that she does radically divert from the normative kind of ideal white, slim, upper middle class woman who kind of embodies a lot of these kind of debates. And there's other ways that we kind of recognize Lizzo for the ways that she, again, doesn't kind of turns confidence culture on its head. And in many ways, she feeds it and she's very much kind of embodying it. But she also offers really interesting ways that are highlighting, she highlights the labor that confidence takes. She talks a lot in her interviews, again, on our many platforms. She talks about how much work it takes to become confident and to love yourself, something that is completely masked in many of the other examples that we've looked at.
Okay, we'll take one final question from Noam, who's reading from online.
So this is an online question from Stefania, a student in London. How can women escape the confidence loophole in the workplace?
Big question.
Well, to start with, I think all the words that have been used, I think picking up on your word deprivatizing, needs to be deprivatized. Picking up on what Pumla said about it needs to be collectivized, it needs to be about collective resistance, it needs to be politicized. I think that, starting to critique it and critique the insidious ways that it gets inside us and that we start to believe ourselves to, have a confidence deficit as being the main thing that's holding us back rather than capitalism is a good start. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would add to cite Rose's the title of one of many of Rose's articles, Let's Get Angry Again.
I think that's probably quite a good note to end on. So that remains for us to thank our panelists, thank Shani and Roz for a wonderful presentation and introduction to your work, and congratulate you again on this fantastic book.